could consuming adequate omega-3s reduce your dementia risk?
Yes. When they do autopsies on people who died of dementia, we've seen that they have lower omega-3 levels in the brain. But it's doing something across the body, not just good for your brain health. Consistently, we see people who have the highest omega-3 levels live longest.
Dr. Bill Harris is the world's leading expert on omega-3 fatty acids and a professor in the Sanford School of Medicine at the University of South Dakota. And Professor Sarah Berry is a world leader in large-scale human nutritional studies, a professor in nutrition at King's College London, and chief scientist at Zoe. If you have ever wondered about omega-3, fish oils, and brain health, then this podcast is for you.
Omega-3s are fatty acids typically found in fish and fish oils. When we eat them, they end up getting into your cells. They sort of act like grease on a hinge on a door, because every cell has doors that let good things in, like nutrients, and a door to dump the trash. If you don't got enough omega-3, some of the good stuff doesn't get in, some of the bad stuff doesn't get out as well. It's helping us stay alive and resilient longer.
There's some really exciting new research, though, around brain health.
Yes, and what they've discovered is surprising. Higher omega-3 levels are linked with less depression and anxiety.
What would you advise in terms of omega-3 supplements and whether we really need them? Welcome to Zoe, Science and Nutrition, where world-leading scientists explain how their research can improve your health. Bill, thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
And Sarah, it's great to have you as my co-host today.
Pleasure.
So Bill, we have this thing that we always do at the start of the show, which is a set of rapid-fire questions and answers that come in from our listeners. Now, we have one very strict rule, which is very hard for professors. You're allowed to say yes or no, or if you have to, a one-sentence answer. You willing to give it a go?
Let's try it.
All right. Are the majority of people in the West deficient in omega-3?
Yes.
Are plant-based sources of omega-3 as good as animal sources?
No.
Is grass-fed beef high in omega-3?
No.
Are supplements the best way to get adequate amounts of omega-3?
They're an adequate way. I prefer food.
Bill, could consuming adequate omega-3s reduce your dementia risk?
Yes.
And what's the biggest myth you've heard about omega-3s?
That plant-based omega-3s are the same as fish-based omega-3.
Love that one. I hear that all the time.
And it's not true?
That's a myth.
Absolutely not true.
I remember growing up that my parents always had fish oil supplements. And there was also a period that I was being told I should be eating lots of salmon. Then I feel I was told, well, that's not such a good idea. And now I'm just sort of confused about omega-3s. And I suspect there are a lot of listeners who are in the same situation that I'm in. And I understand that you just have some fascinating new research about how omega-3s might affect not just our heart health, but also our brain health, from mental health to dementia. But before we jump into how this affects our health, could we just start with, what are these omega-3 fatty acids? Why are they essential? Why do we care?
Why do we care? So omega-3 fatty acids are fatty acids typically found in fish oils. They're made primarily by these little single-celled organisms in the ocean that convert sunlight and sugar into omega-3 fatty acids. And then the little fish eat the little cells, and then the big fish eat the little fish. And so, like salmon, for example, doesn't really make omega-3 any better than we do, but they eat it. So their levels are high because they eat a lot. Why are they essential? Sitting here with Sarah, I can't really say essential because EPA and DHA, which are the two omega-3s that are most important that are in fish oils, fish and fish oils, are not actually essential in the diet because, strictly speaking, in a nutritionist point of view, if you have an essential nutrient, if you don't eat it, you die. And there are plenty of people on this planet who are vegans who eat no preformed EPA and DHA. They eat the precursor, and that apparently gives them enough to survive, grow up, reproduce, and live a life. So I think of EPA and DHA omega-3s as very bioactive, very important for health, but not essential for life.
I've gone from omega-3s and now you've already mentioned DHA and EPA. Could you just help me to understand that?
Right. So omega-3 is like a class, a family. If you look at the chemical structure of it, they all have a similar last name, so to speak, which is omega-3. And then there are 4 or 5 fatty acids in that family. The two that are the 3 that we hear most about, one is called ALA, which is alpha-linolenic acid, which is a plant-based omega-3. And then its grown-up super cousins are the 2 that we get in fish, which are called EPA and DHA. EPA and DHA are the 2 that are in fish. ALA is the one that's in plants. And those are the 3 major ones in the family.
Why do they matter at all? You were saying they're not literally essential, so I can live without them. So they're not like sort of vitamin C, I don't get scurvy.
Correct. You don't get scurvy. Right.
But I get the sense that they are doing something of importance.
Yeah, they are important for many biological factors. They find their home in, when we eat them, they end up getting into cell membranes. And all our cells have some, or a little or a lot of omega-3, depending on really how much you eat. And I think the way I like to explain why they're useful, and it's a little difficult sometimes because it's not like you can say for vitamin C, if you don't have vitamin C, your teeth fall out. Okay, that's a problem. Omega-3 is more subtle, but as the omega-3s get into the cell membranes, they sort of act like grease on a hinge on a door, because every cell has doors that let good things in, like nutrients, and the cell also has a door that opens up out to dump the trash. And if you've got enough omega-3 in your cell membranes, those doors swing smoothly. If you don't, they don't swing so smoothly, and some of the good stuff doesn't get in, some of the bad stuff doesn't get out as well, and the cell just gets older and unhealthy.
So they sound quite important.
They're important.
And Bill, I'd love at this point to pick up on the myth that you said, which is about plant-based sources, because you've now talked about EPA, DHA, which are found in fish, and then ALA, the alpha-linolenic acid, which we know can come from plant sources. And lots of people say, well, you can get all the EPA and DHA you need from plant sources, but we know that actually how much you can convert is actually quite small.
Quite small.
And so I wonder if you could explain a little bit about that to listeners.
Sure. There is a mechanism in the body. There are processes that will take ALA, which is 18 carbons long. So fatty acids are simply a linear chain of carbon atoms. And this one's 18 carbons long. And it has 3 what we call double bonds in chemistry. Many fatty acids have no double bonds. These have 3 double bonds. The EPA and DHA are 20 or 22 carbons long, and they have 5 and 6 double bonds. So in order to go from the ALA, which is 18 carbons and 3, you got to add 2 or 4 more carbons to the molecule, and you got to add more double bonds. There's a lot of processing there, and it's difficult to do. The body is maybe 5% of the ALA you eat might get converted to EPA, and less than that goes on to DHA. So it's much more, if you really want to increase your EPA and DHA levels, the important omega-3s, eating them preformed is the best way to do it. You don't have to make them.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, because lots of people, Jonathan, say, well, you can get all of your really good omega-3s, which is what Bill's been talking about, the EPA and DHA from plant sources, through this process in the body where it converts the ALA to these longer chain, more desaturated versions. But actually the conversion is really limited. And so it's interesting to hear, it's estimated only around 5%. And so that's why, as nutrition scientists, we always say, if you can, get what we call preformed EPA and DHA, because our bodies are pretty rubbish at converting it.
Can I just ask one clarification? Because you were describing the way that these omega-3s sort of help my cells let things in and out better. And this is why it's like better, like a more finely performing cell is how I was understanding.
Sure, I think that's fair.
It needs to be the EPA and DHA types of omega-3, not the ALA that was from plants. Is that what you're saying?
That's correct.
So if I eat all of this stuff from plants, it's got this ALA, omega-3, but then my body, I'm thinking about some sort of like refinement process, right? From crude oil to petrol. Like it's a lot of hard work to turn this then into these special forms of omega-3.
Right.
But if I were to eat them directly, then I don't need to do the refinement and it goes straight to help clean me out.
Yeah. A fair amount of the ALA we eat just gets burned like other fats. So it doesn't even get a chance to be converted into EPA and DHA in the liver, which is pretty much where that happens. So right away, you're behind the 8 ball because you're losing a lot of it just for energy.
Imagine a version of yourself in 6 months' time. Someone who's made a few small changes and feels dramatically better because of it. That's why we make this show, to give you the science and the tools to get there. But to keep doing that, we need your support. If you've gotten value from this episode, hit subscribe. You'll get a front row seat to the latest science, and we'll keep doing the work to bring it straight to you. Okay, now back to the show.
Omega-3, like Bill said, it's a big family of different fatty acids, but each of them have different roles. The ALA has a different role to the DHA, to the EPA, for example. And so that's why you can't just assume because you've got ALA in your nuts that, hey, that's you on omega-3 sorted. So, Bill, lots of people are eating less fish now than before. Lots of people are vegan, lots of people are vegetarian. Can you estimate what the prevalence is in the US, in the UK, of people who are deficient in omega-3?
Oh, who are deficient in omega-3? Well, we need to define deficient. The healthiest level, we think from our research, is to be 8%, meaning 8% of the fats in the membrane are EPA and DHA. The level that's fairly common in the US and Western Europe is around 5%. We've seen vegans and US military personnel, sorry to say, in the 3.5% level, which is quite low. So under 4% we think is where you don't want to be. Over 8 is where you do want to be. About 95% of Americans are under that 8%. So to call that deficient, I'll say that they're not optimal.
And I think that 8% that I often teach to our students, the Omega Index that I know you've published a lot on, I always explain to them, this is kind of what I would consider optimal based on your research, that's optimal in terms of, a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, a lower risk of all-cause mortality, those kind of outcomes.
That's true. Right. It's linked with many good outcomes. And so 8% is uncommon. It's achievable.
If generally you get these best forms of omega-3 from these oily fish, lots of our ancestors grew up nowhere near a salmon or an oily fish. And, I often hear the story, we come from hunter-gatherers in Africa. Can you help me to understand, was there omega-3 sources there? Is this about saying that as human beings, we work fine without them, but we can be much better with them? Could you just help me to understand that?
First of all, let's examine some of those premises because human beings have always needed water. Wherever they live, they have water. And of course, there's sea coasts and there's rivers. So people have always been able to get fish because they have to be by the water and the fish live in the water. It's interesting. If you look at all the major religions in the world, fish symbols are all over the place. So fish has always been there. You're right. The richest in omega-3 are the deep sea ocean-going fish. But fish in rivers, too, do have some omega-3 fatty acids, too. So I think people have always been getting preformed omega-3 from eating fish. It's not like at one time we didn't have any omega-3 and then we did.
Because I hear this word oily fish. It's not just salmon.
It's not just oily. Those are the best sources, but not the only sources.
But a lot of other fish had some, so we would have got this in our diet.
It's a whole spectrum of omega-3 levels. So all I know is in the current context, pretty much of the Western diet, where we have plenty of calories, we have plenty of omega-6, we have plenty of other nutrients. We know now that this 8% is a healthy target. You go back 200 years, people didn't live past 50 years old. So a lot of these diseases of aging that we see now weren't a problem then because people didn't live to see them. So it's hard to really guess what's going on in human evolution.
That's actually a brilliant transition to my next question, really, which is understanding how these omega-3s are actually affecting our health. And you were describing that, with this omega index, if 8% level, it's much better than 5%. What is that affecting in somebody's health?
Every cell gets these signals from the body, from outside the body, saying, hey, we've got an inflammation we've got to deal with. And the cell has to respond and make certain chemicals. And if it responds properly, the inflammation comes and then it goes away. And that's the way it's supposed to be. cell membranes become more flexible. Stiff cell membranes don't respond very well. Flexible ones are able to be kind of fleet of foot. You can move quickly. The general idea is just being flexible is a good thing. And the omega-3s help make that membrane more flexible.
So the first time I'd heard about omega-3s was related to heart health. I think that was sort of the story that, as just a regular member of the public, I had picked up.
Mm-hmm. That's where it started, right?
Is that right? And how does that work?
Yeah, 1970s, two investigators from Copenhagen, Dyerberg and Bang, heard these stories about these Inuits in Greenland who were apparently not having heart attacks, despite the fact they were eating, by the standards of the day, 1970s, a terrible diet. Virtually no fruits and vegetables, lots of saturated fat, lots of animal fat, lots of cholesterol, which they should be falling over from heart attacks all the time by our current worldview. But they were not. It was a paradox, so they went over to check it out, and they analyzed the food, they analyzed the blood of these people and what's going on, and they found on their analysis of the blood and the food these unusual fats, fatty acids, EPA and DHA. And then they started thinking, well, that's different than the Danes back home. They don't have those fatty acids in their blood. What do they do? And then these guys did some experiments to show that actually these fatty acids make the blood thinner, less likely to clot. And they said, aha, that's why they don't have heart attacks, because these fatty acids are reducing the tendency of the blood to clot. And it was believed at the time, and it's still somewhat true, that a clot in the coronary arteries of the heart will cause a heart attack. And so if you can prevent that, kind of like taking an aspirin, same idea, but this came from food. So it all began in heart disease.
And how do you said that's how we understood it then? Do we still believe it's important for our heart health? And if so,
yes. There's no uncontroversial fatty acid at this point, except perhaps trans fats. I don't know. But they're very complicated. All the fatty acids do different things. And there's, again, omega-6 family, omega-3 family, a monounsaturated family, a saturated family, and there's subsets of all those. And we are much more understanding of what individual types of fatty acids do, which they didn't know at the time. Back in the 70s, it was animal fat was bad. Plant fat was good. End of story. We had this thing called the P to S ratio, the polyunsaturated to saturated ratio. And that, so the Eskimo diet didn't fit well into that paradigm, and so it just didn't make sense until these Danish investigators said these two fatty acids are actually good. And so it kind of opened up the window into, well, individual fatty acids have different roles in biology, and we need to understand them.
And I think in those experiments that they did with the Inuits many years ago, there's a really nice way to visualize it is if you were to cut your finger, so when the Inuits cut their finger, they bled for a lot longer than the Danes because their blood, very simply put, like Bill said, it is thinner. So you're producing less of these kind of clotting factors, etc. So they just keep bleeding. I mean, okay, eventually
to a
it
point,
kicks in.
yeah. And then this is one of the controversies about omega-3s now. Do they increase risk for bleeding? And the answer really is no, in a meaningful way. But nobody's eating the amount of omega-3 that these Eskimos ate either.
And you said that there was a theory then about how it helped our heart health, but maybe this has changed. So today, how do we understand that these EPA and DHA are helping our heart?
Yeah, it's that and more. Yes, they still thin the blood. And that is still a mechanism by which they reduce risk for heart attacks. But they also affect the heart muscle in different ways. One thing they do is, and it's not really clear how they do it, but they actually lower your heart rate. Drops your heart rate from 2, 3, 4 beats a minute, which has long-term effects. I mean, some people think you get a certain number of heartbeats per life, and that's it. Once they're all used up, they're used up. We've looked at animals, in slow heart rates, long lives. Animals, really fast heart rates, short lives. And so reducing heart rate actually is a good thing. It says your body is using oxygen better. The blood is flowing better. The cells are using the oxygen because it doesn't have to beat so fast. So that's one thing it does. It also reduces the chance that you will have what's called an arrhythmia, which is when the heart beats irregularly. And that can be fairly innocuous or lethal, depending on where it is and how it happens. So the omega-3s reduce the risk for that. Reduce blood pressure to some extent. They reduce levels of one of the blood lipids called triglycerides, which is somewhat of a risk factor for heart disease. They make the blood vessels more elastic so that they're not so stiff, so the blood can get, and the red blood cells can probably move because they're more flexible. They have to kind of line up when they go through a capillary at the end of the arterial system. They get into the tissues. They have to line up and go one by one through these little capillaries, and they have to compress, which is where they offload oxygen, pick up carbon dioxide, and head back to the heart. The omega-3s make it easier. A rich omega-3 level in a cell makes it easier to do that. So all these things play together for heart health.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating when you hear Bill explain so many different mechanisms. Some people just talk about cholesterol or just talk about blood clotting. There's so many different ways that the EPA, the DHA, omega-3s impact factors related to heart health. I think what I've seen recently that's been a little bit frustrating is some controversy because of some really big studies that came out saying actually no, omega-3 supplementation doesn't help heart health. And I think it's a really important point of time to kind of clear that up, that there are lots of studies out there consistently show improved effects on these intermediary risk factors. Yes, there has been the odd epidemiological study that maybe questions that. But actually, if you look at the totality of the evidence and you look at depending on dose, you look at depending on who's actually, receiving it, is it pre-heart attacks, post-heart attacks, etc. I would love you to give a top line of whether you as an expert in this agree that taking it as a supplement improves heart health.
Yes, I think it does. And just a short little rabbit trail, you mentioned cholesterol. If I had another shot at a myth, is that fish oils lower cholesterol, but they do not. They lower triglycerides, which is another blood lipid, right? So anyway, that's off the table now. And that's okay. They still reduce risk for heart disease. So the controversy that you're referring to is about atrial fibrillation, what's called AFib. And that's not a fatal kind of rhythm. There's a ventricular arrhythmia, which means the lower parts of your heart go wacky and they stop pumping blood, and that'll kill you right away. That's bad.
Sounds bad.
That's bad. But atrial fibrillation, which is the two upper chambers, when they don't quite beat in synchrony, it doesn't kill you by any means. It's annoying. It feels like a fast heartbeat. And it does increase risk for strokes because if your blood is not moving properly through the heart, you can actually have some blood clots in your heart. They go to your brain. So that's a concern about AFib. And there have been 2 or 3 big studies where they gave omega-3, high doses of omega-3, and actually pharmaceutical forms of omega-3 to patients who are at very high risk for heart disease. That was the point of the study, to see if they could help. And in both of those studies, they saw a small increase in risk for atrial fibrillation from the people that were getting the omega-3, the high dose, roughly 3 or 4 grams of EPA and DHA, which is way beyond what most people would ever supplement. These studies, you have a placebo group that's getting nothing, essentially, and then you have your omega-3 group. The placebo group, say, had developed over this 4 or 5 years AFib, say 2% of the people developed AFib. On the omega-3 side, 3% developed AFib. Well, the way we express that in medicine is that's a 50% increase in risk because 3% is 50% higher than 2%. But it's only 1% what we call absolute risk increase, very small, actually. This is not published yet, but we've just finished a big meta-analysis, the summary of lots of studies together that have looked at this, and we found that this only occurs in that particular setting, high-risk cardiovascular patients getting 3 to 4 grams of EPA and DHA. That's the group where this increase happens. Again, it's a small absolute risk, but in people who are just taking dietary supplements or eating fish, there's no increased risk for AFib. So it's not a concern for the dietary supplement world or the fish eating world because you're not getting those 3 and 4 grams a day of EPA. Most people taking dietary supplements are getting probably between 500 and maybe 1,500 milligrams a day of EPA and DHA. That would be a great dose, but it's not the 3 and 4 grams. And so it's the high dose, I think, that's causing this concern about atrial fibrillation. Fish oil supplement use is not associated with increased risk for any cardiovascular outcome.
It's so conclusive that fish oil supplementation improves so many aspects related to heart health, except for a minority of people at very high dose.
Could you clarify then, I guess, when you look across all of this, like what are the benefits for heart health?
Consistently, we see people who have the highest omega-3 levels live the longest. And a good example of that is like Japan. The Japanese, just because of their diet, have a omega-3 index that's about 8 or 9% on average. So it's like twice as high as the West. And they live on average 4.5 years longer than we in the US live. Despite the fact they smoke more, despite the fact they have more high blood pressure than we do, despite the fact they have more stress than we do, they live longer. And I hate to attribute all of that to an omega-3 effect, and I can't, but I can say that's one brick in the wall. And when we look at risk for death from heart disease, it's the same story. Higher omega-3, lower risk for death from heart disease, lower risk for death from cancer, lower risk for death from all other causes combined with high omega-3. So it's doing something across not just heart health. It's helping us stay alive and resilient longer.
And if you choose to take supplements, is there evidence that if you take supplements that will improve my heart health?
Yeah, they're right. That's, again, back to the UK Biobank. There have been several studies that just looked at fish oil supplement use. Yes, no. It's a very crude measure because we don't know how much they're taking, how frequently they're taking, what product they're taking, any of that stuff. It's just a yes, no. But the people who are taking omega-3 supplements in that UK Biobank are lower risk for multiple kinds of heart outcomes. We've looked at stroke and we looked at blood levels of omega-3, which is much better than asking people if they take fish oil. Just look at their blood levels. And we find that the higher the blood level, the lower the risk for stroke, which contradicts that whole atrial fibrillation concern because the problem with AFib is increased risk of stroke. Well, even in the studies, the big studies with the pharmaceutical products, where they reported this, 1 or 2% increase in risk for AFib, they had like 20% reduced risk for stroke. So the omega-3s are still benefiting heart health in a wide variety of ways, even in these people with, with high risk for heart disease who are taking high dose pharmaceutical products. They're still getting a lot of good heart benefit, even if there is a small increased risk for AFib.
So I think, Jonathan, the evidence is really clear that omega-3s beneficially impact heart health. I think it's really important to say as well, for any skeptics out there, one fantastic thing about omega-3 is because we can't make it, it means that any increase in the blood we know is coming from what you're eating. Because people often say, oh, well, how do you know? It's because it's what they're eating. So this is one fact that we can say, actually, what's in the blood is coming from the food you're eating. And so I think where there's some really exciting new research, though, is around brain health. Mm-hmm. And I think this is something, certainly when I was teaching, even up until a few years ago, a lot of what I was saying was, oh, we just don't know yet. And I know this is something you focused on more recently in your research. So it'd be great to understand a little bit about what the latest evidence says around omega-3 and brain health.
Sure. And I'm sure when you do your lectures, you start with babies in the womb and the formation of the brain in the first place, which is very important because the brain has a lot of one of the two omega-3s called DHA is part of the structure of the brain. And that's important from the very beginning. In your eyes, too, right? Actually, the eye is an extension of the brain. And the level of omega-3 in the retina, the back of the eye, is one of the highest in the whole body. So there's it's there for a reason. It's always there for a reason. The omega-3 story in dementia has been growing over time. We know that when they do autopsies on people who died of dementia compared to controls who died of something else, those who had dementia have lower omega-3 levels in the brain. Okay, that's one piece of the story. We've seen that higher levels of omega-3 in the blood, higher omega-3 index, predicts a lower risk for developing Alzheimer's disease or all-cause dementia over time. So that's another important piece of it. If your B vitamin nutrition is good, then the omega-3s seem to help increase cognition, improve brain health, reduce risk for developing dementia. If your B vitamin levels are too low, actually, I'm talking about homocysteine, which is a particular molecule in the blood that responds to, that's kind of a barometer of how well your B vitamins are working. If that homocysteine level is high, the omega-3 effect goes away. So there's what we call an interaction here between those two nutrients. And so it's important to get good B vitamin nutrition, good omega-3 nutrition for brain health. But it's been difficult to show in the kind of randomized trial that we're all used to, give somebody some omega-3 for 3 or 4 years and then another group not, and then see who develops dementia. We haven't got time. Or either that or you pick people who are already so far down the road, you can't do anything about it. At this point, the omega-3 and brain health connection is mostly, I think, based on these observational data, what we call epidemiology, more so than randomized trials, because we haven't got that much randomized trial data yet.
And what about in relation to mental health more generally?
Yeah, mental health is right. We just got a paper accepted a couple days ago on anxiety and depression as a function of omega-3 levels. And again, higher omega-3 levels are always linked with less current depression and anxiety and less risk for developing it over time.
And Bill, I think a lot of people listening will be really surprised this shift from like heart health and dementia to like anxiety and depression, because most of us were brought up with this idea that our mind and our bodies are separate, and like the first slight's like really physical, but anxiety and depression, like how could that be affected by how much salmon I ate? Do you understand at all what's going on there?
No.
I love the honesty.
Short answer. I can't tell you what's going on. I mean, some of the cells in the brain are kind of there to reduce inflammation. A certain small part, not the big chunks of it, but there are certain cells that are their job is to control inflammation, and the omega-3s can get into those cells and help reduce inflammatory signaling in the brain. And that's good, but at this point, we're just seeing associations between a high omega-3. That doesn't, strictly speaking, and Sarah understands this very well, because you have an association doesn't mean you have a cause.
Yeah, so this is what I'm fascinated by now listening to. Have there been any supplement trials where they give people omega-3 supplements and see whether it reduces levels of depression, levels of anxiety, improves mood, happiness, those kind of things?
Yeah, right.
Should people who are not feeling happy, should people who are suffering from depression, in addition to whatever therapy they have, also be taking omega-3?
I say yes, the answer to that. There have been studies, particularly in depression, for many years. And what they've discovered was somewhat surprising to most people, because when you pool together a bunch of studies that were done to try to affect depressive symptoms, some of the supplements that were used in those studies are rich in DHA. Some of them are richer in EPA. They both have, all the supplements have both, but some heavier EPA, heavier DHA. And the hypothesis has always been, well, pretty simple. The brain's got a lot of DHA, so give it DHA. So that ought to be the one. Well, it turns out that when they look at these studies, they say, well, interesting, the studies that provide a supplement that's richer in EPA are the ones that seem to find a reduction in depressive symptoms, not the ones that have DHA. So again, a good hypothesis out the window, but, based on observational research. And the theoretical explanation is that the EPA is more of an anti-inflammatory omega-3 than DHA. And that's something about getting more EPA. EPA doesn't really get into the flesh of your brain. It doesn't get incorporated, but it is in the blood circulation throughout your whole brain. And it can be made into some molecules that are anti-inflammatory that may help reduce risk for depression.
So your recommendation to people who are suffering from an array of mental health issues would be, in addition to whatever therapy they have, to also try fish oil supplements, but focusing on EPA-rich ones?
Yeah. People always ask, is EPA better than DHA? And I always say they're both good. They're both in nature. They're always together in fish. We always eat them together. I think we should have all of them in a supplement. Maybe for depression, we have evidence that richer in EPA would be better.
And that's because the anti-inflammatory effect of EPA rather than the structural effect
Presumably,
of
yes, that's
DHA
right.
has in our brain.
Right.
So that when we're eating, let's say, a portion of fish, we've got two things happening. We've got an increase in DHA in our brain because of the structural components, and then the EPA then helping with the inflammation.
Yeah, and this is complicated because we know that giving more EPA and DHA will raise blood cell omega-3 levels, the omega-3 index. And from other studies, we know that you can increase the level of omega-3 in your liver, in your kidneys, in your heart, in your lung. But brain is not so easily moved. Just take an adult like you and me and start giving us omega-3 and DHA. We could take a biopsy of the brain. We would probably see that the DHA level's not going up. Yeah, there is this blood-brain barrier that's very specific. And at this point, I don't think we can say that taking DHA is actually going to raise your brain tissue DHA levels. It's good for your brain health, but it doesn't have to be because it became part of the meat of your brain. It could be doing other things in the brain that could be even just the blood vessels that go through, improving the circulation of the blood through the brain would be helpful without changing the composition of the brain. So I think that's still an area of active research, is trying to figure out why when you give omega-3s, you don't really get you can see an increase in cerebrospinal fluid, which is the fluid that flows around the brain and spinal cord. And you can get more omega-3 in there. But actually, as part of the brain tissue, doesn't seem to go up like it does in the liver.
So is there a window of opportunity? Because I know we often talk about making sure during pregnancy you're getting enough because of how important it is for your baby, but also for young children. And I think a lot of parents, Jonathan, don't think about this. Is there a window of opportunity to make sure that you are as a pregnant woman, but also your children are getting it, to make sure there is enough DHA in the brain? Very simplistic question, I'm afraid.
No,
it's
right.
Quite confusing.
It's a great question, and it makes the most sense for pregnant women to be sure they're getting enough omega-3, particularly DHA, during pregnancy, because all the omega-3 that your baby's getting is coming from mom, whether it's in utero or from breast milk. Optimizing the amount of omega-3 early in life, it makes the most sense to me. And really, brain development goes up till like 18 or 20 years of age, actually, right? Most of it is in that first 1,000 days of life where your brain is really put together. And that's the most important time to get the omega-3s. You get a good standing for the rest of your life. I'm not sure it will stay if you eat cheeseburgers the rest of your life.
So my daughter is 6. So you're saying at this point already it's sort of too late to change this DHA in her brain because of this barrier that you were describing?
No, I wouldn't throw my hands up in despair. My grandkids and my kids, back then, we made sure they have omega-3 all the time they're growing up. It's safe. We don't know for sure what it's doing all the time. We have good indications that higher levels are good across the lifespan. So why not do it? The risk is zero.
Can I ask a clarification question? Because you were talking about EPA and DHA and saying that for depression, the EPA seemed to be more critical. Before you were talking about your research around dementia.
I think a mix is always best for overall health, above and below the neck.
So I'm definitely sitting here thinking I need to make sure I get enough omega-3 in my diet. It feels like a very strong pitch from Bill, with a lot of support here from you, Sarah. And just before we talk about the advice, the first question I have now is, well, I'd like to measure my own omega-3 levels because you've been talking about that. Can I ask my doctor to measure my omega-3 index and see whether I'm at this magic 8% level already?
Yeah, your doctor will be a deer in the headlights.
I was about to say they'd be pretty cross in England if you asked them that.
What's the omega-3 index? He'd say, hey, they don't know.
They don't know.
But yes, it can be done. This is where personalized nutrition, people taking their health in their own hands, I think is really important. In the UK particularly, it's very easy to get the omega-3 index done, but you just go online and order the test. They'll send you a little kit in the mail. You prick your finger, you drop a blood on it, put it in the mail, and in about a week, you get a report of your omega-3 index.
We do actually measure this in our Zoe Predict studies. So we have this big Zoe Predict cohort. In a subgroup of that 300,000 people, we have measurements of all of the different fatty acids. So not just the saturated, mono and polyunsaturated, but the individual fatty acids, including the EPA, the DHA, the ALA.
You have 300,000 people?
We have 300,000 people in our Predict cohort.
And all women?
Which is, no, so they're about 65% women, 35% men, a huge proportion of peri and postmenopausal. And we just have this gold mine of data. It's mind-blowing as a scientist what we have.
How many do you have blood on?
We use a device called Tasso, and so we have that on all of them. And then on a subgroup of individuals, which is probably about 10,000 now, we have the fatty acids who would be able to do the omega index.
10,000 is great. Yeah.
But what's amazing with this cohort, we can start to really dig down into the kind of things that we've been talking about and the nuances that's so important in nutrition.
That's fantastic. UK only?
UK and US.
And US. Oh, that's fantastic.
I would like to talk about, okay, what do you do if you want to hit this magic 8% number? And you have a suspicion that you're in the 90 to 95% of people you described who don't have that. So could you describe how someone could try and get there?
Sure. So I think the most important thing is to start with knowing where you're at. So getting a blood test to know your omega-3 index to begin with. That's your baseline. We did a study several years ago pooling data from 14 different other studies that we had done where we had measured omega-3 index before and after. And we were able to figure out how much omega-3 in additional you need to get EPA DHA in order to go from where you are now to 8%. And so we've reduced that down to a mathematical equation that's sort of buried in the website. And so if you come back as a 5% or a 4%, 4% would be not atypical. If you put that in the calculator, you're going to find that you need about 1,500 milligrams more a day of EPA and DHA together. That's a place to start. There's a lot of variability in how each individual responds to omega-3 intake. But on average, that's a great place to start. And you could eat salmon every day, or you could start taking an omega-3 supplement. Red blood cells, which is where we measure the omega-3 index, you get a whole new crop of red blood cells every 4 months. And so now you can, after 3 and 4 months, you could do another test and see where you're at. We call it titration. You test, you intervene, and then you test again and see what the result was. And if you're where you want to be, keep doing it. If you're not, you need more.
Bill, you've said quite a large amount, as in 1 serving every day. Something that I hear anecdotally a lot of people saying to me is, oh, but I'm worried about mercury. I've heard that if you have too much oily fish, it's going to give you mercury poisoning. And I believe it's actually preventing a lot of people from increasing their oily fish intake. I think it's really important to get some clarity on that.
Very important. Mercury has gotten way more a much bigger concern than it really is. It's primarily a concern originally in pregnant women and young children. And back in the early 2000s, the Food and Drug Administration put out this warning about mercury in fish based on some, I think, very narrowly flawed research. And there's good evidence that that advice caused lots of pregnant women to say, I'm not going to eat any fish. Even though there's only maybe 4 fish, swordfish, tilefish, king mackerel, shark, things that nobody eats anyway. Those are the ones that had high mercury, and that was the warning in the United States, in the FDA. Stay away from those fish. Well, women stay away from those fish anyway. I mean, salmon has virtually no mercury in it. Sardines, mackerel, herring, virtually no mercury. Those high omega-3. Just the amount of omega-3 and the amount of mercury are not related to each other.
So unless it's those quite unusual fish, you're saying, don't worry.
Don't worry about it. Absolutely. And for God's sake, don't avoid eating fish because you're worried about mercury.
Salmon every day is a lot of salmon. Like, I think I don't want to eat salmon every day.
Okay, you can mix it up with sardines.
Is that like to get my very most optimal? Do I really need to eat this every
right.
day?
I think I wanted to make the point that you don't have to take supplements.
Okay.
To get to an 8%. You can do it with fish. And I was just giving an example of salmon every day. Right, you could eat salmon twice a week. You could eat maybe mackerel once a week, and you might get up to 8%. It just depends on you, and it's very possible. But if you don't want to do that, supplements are a fine substitute for that. A serving of salmon once a week, maybe 1,200 milligrams of EPA and DHA. Well, that's divided out by 7. That's about 200 milligrams a day. Well, that's twice the average American intake right there of omega-3 fatty, which is around 100, 150 milligrams is on average what Americans eat. So you double it or triple it by just eating an oily fish once a week. So it's a good thing to do. It's just not going to get you, by and large, to 8%. You're going to need to eat more than that.
And that pushes you towards supplements, it sounds like, realistically, if you're going to stay at that, unless you are an Inuit or maybe some of the Japanese that you were describing about the level of fish intake.
Right.
Just before we go on to supplements, I know that one of the questions we get a lot is about farmed fish. So not about mercury, but I think concerns actually about the overall health. And Sarah, you talk a lot about this, right? About thinking about the overall health of a food rather than just one element. Mm-hmm. And concerns that like their farming might not be very healthy.
2010, 2012, there was a report that got a ton of press about not mercury in salmon, in farm salmon, but PCBs, dioxins, other industrial organic chemicals that are not good for you. And this has set off alarms all over the world. And most of these fish that they, in this particular study, were from the Baltic Sea and the North Sea farming. And it turns out that the reason that those salmon that they were feeding had those levels was because the food, the oil that they got from other fish that they feed the salmon, because the salmon need to be fed fish oil in order to get the omega-3s up. The fish oils were not, that they were feeding them were not clean. They had those pollutants in them. So it was true. But the industry has cleaned it up tremendously. Our lab in Scotland is also an aquamarine lab, meaning they analyze fish carcasses for the industry. And there are very strict levels on PCBs, dioxins, and they're not there anymore. Now, salmon, which is kind of the classic farm fish, used to be back, say, 10, 20 years ago when fish oil wasn't so expensive. It's expensive now because people want supplements. There's a demand. So fish oil's gotten expensive. Salmon producers have been reducing the amount of fish oil in the feed and increasing the amount of plant oils in the feed, trying to balance cost and health and longevity and nutritional composition. So the omega-3 level's gone down in salmon. Now it's about the level of wild salmon. It used to be higher. It used to be you get more omega-3 per serving of farmed salmon than wild. Now they're about the same. So I don't have a problem with farmed salmon. It's still a great source of meat. It's not as good a source as it was maybe 20 years ago, but that doesn't mean it's not a great source today. It still is.
I think, Bill, it really nicely leads us on to another myth that I think is really important to cover briefly while you're here. And this is around the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. And so one of the reasons people say, farm fish isn't as good is because it's got, by being fattier, it's also got a higher amount of omega-6. I'd love to quickly get your perspective, if you can give me kind of top-line views on the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, because it's everywhere at the moment in relation to seed oils and so many other things.
And I think the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio is a useless metric for so many reasons. Number one, it assumes the omega-6 fatty acids are bad, and that's not true. Linoleic acid is the one we're talking about. Linoleic is the primary omega-3 and seed oil, omega-6 in seed oils and in our diet. And higher levels of linoleic acid in the blood are associated with lower risk for heart disease, for diabetes, for all-cause mortality. Everything is better with higher levels of the major omega-6. So the idea that it's bad is wrong. So there's no reason to have a ratio of something good to good. It doesn't make any sense. Secondly, you can have high levels of omega-6, high levels of omega-3 in a food, or you could have low levels of omega-6 and omega-3, and you have exactly the same ratio. If your ratio is wrong, the thing to do is not to reduce your omega-6, is to increase your omega-3. So if you increase the denominator, the ratio gets smaller. That's okay. That's a reasonable response. But I think this dependence on the omega-6 and omega-3 ratio is way outdated. That's from the 80s. It's should just be thrown in the trash can and ignored. We need to look at the amounts of fatty acids we're eating, not this ratio.
Thank you. This is exactly what I say and why I get a lot of hate mail. I wonder if we can go back to thinking about how we can increase our omega-3 levels. You've talked about having oily fish, you've talked about supplements. I think something really important to cover is at what point should we be supplementing through our life course? Is it safe to give young children supplements? Should we be having higher doses as we get older?
I think, yes, it's safe to supplement children. Again, in that like 1,000 milligram a day EPA DHA is no question about that being healthy.
From what
helpful.
age?
It's hard to draw a line in the sand. If I could, dictate, I'd say from -9 months through your life. Okay. I don't see any place where, all of a sudden, now here is where you need it. Clearly, it's increasing your omega-3 levels is always going to help somewhat. And the earlier you do it, the better. The more you hit, because these are what we call fat-soluble nutrients. So they stay in the body a lot longer than the water-soluble things like vitamin C, which kind of come and go. But the fat-soluble ones stay in longer. And the longer you feed omega-3s into your cells, the levels just go up.
And Bill, can you overdose on omega-3?
Not that we know of. It's kind of self-limiting in a sense that people just can't eat that much fish. Again, the Japanese, who eat much more than we do, are healthier than we are. So we haven't seen it. The other issue that comes up is bleeding. And that was a concern. As you mentioned, you cut an Eskimo's finger back in the day and it would bleed a lot, or nosebleeds. You would have pictures of blood all over the place. And this scared people. And we did find in early studies that we were doing that you give high doses of omega-3, you will increase what's called the bleeding time. It increases, but it increases like aspirin increases it. Not outrageous, not hemorrhaging, not you're going to die from a nosebleed, none of that stuff. And then we've looked at other studies lately, or not lately, over the last several years, of people who are taking blood thinners already or taking aspirin and seeing that taking omega-3 on top of those does not increase the risk for anything that's clinically significant bleeding.
And if I make this change and increase the amount that I'm taking, how long might it take for me to feel some of the effects of this optimal level of omega-3?
Good question. And I'm not sure you can feel an effect of omega-3. The thing that we hear people are given omega-3s, say, to lower their blood triglyceride levels, for example. That's a pharmaceutical reason to take it. You don't feel a blood triglyceride level. You don't feel a high blood pressure. What you feel is achy joints. And this is the anecdotal experience that we get is that people say, my shoulder just doesn't hurt anymore. My knees feel better now. So that is probably 3, 4, 5 months into taking omega-3s after your tissue levels go up.
So I would love to switch to really clear, actionable advice now. I think we've had this brilliant description. I think lots of people listening are saying like, I'd like to eat more food that has his omega-3 in. Could you just very simply tell us what foods should be in that list?
Well, there's an acronym. We talk about oily fish. SMASH is the acronym. SMASH. So salmon, mackerel. A stands for anchovies. I'm not sure anybody eats.
Oh, I love anchovies.
Except Sarah. Anchovies. S would be sardines, and H is herring. So those are the SMASH fish. And those are really very high the highest omega-3.
And is there anything other than oily fish that has higher levels of omega-3 and therefore is worth adding for that reason?
Without being fortified with omega-3. Like you can feed chickens EPA and DHA, and in their eggs, you'll have more DHA. But that's not natural. It's because you're feeding it to them.
Anything natural?
Anything natural. No, we hear about microalgae. Vegetarians or vegans who want no animal products can take EPA and DHA as algal products. Scientists realize that the original source of omega-3 is certain kinds of microalgae, not seaweed. We're not talking about seaweed. These are single-celled organisms. So they find the exact species that makes EPA or DHA. They put them in a vat in the middle of Iowa, give them sugar and water and sunlight, and they will make EPA and DHA, and then they harvest lipids out of these and put them in capsules. And that is a perfectly good source of EPA and DHA that does not come from an animal.
And if I understood rightly from what you're saying, that is actually sort of the original source of this EPA and
That's
DHA.
where it all comes from.
So when you're eating fish, it's eaten these little algae.
You got it.
It's inside it.
Right.
And these days, honestly, like most of the time I'm eating a fish, it's probably farmed. And so you're describing it sort of being taken and fed sort of manually to these fish, and then I'm eating them. Am I understanding that right?
That's right. You're right. Exactly.
I think it's really important, Jonathan, to clarify, again, thinking back to where we started at the beginning, that when Bill's talking about omega-3, he's specifically talking about the EPA and DHA sources, because I don't want people listening saying, oh, well, hold on, you can get these from flax seeds, from walnuts, etc. Specifically the EPA and DHA.
Yeah. And there's nothing wrong at all with these products that are rich in ALA, flaxseed oil, chia seeds. It's fine. They're good for your variety of other things. It's just not the substitute for fish oils. I think that's really the point. Don't expect that to meet all your omega-3 needs if you're just going to do a plant-based diet.
So could we maybe wrap up with supplementation? Because I think one of my takeaways from this is that for this sort of optimal level that you're talking about, it's actually quite hard to get there. So it feels like that does push you towards supplementation. So I guess my first question is, do you supplement yourself, Bill?
Yes.
Imagine that someone can't do the testing, so they don't know their own baseline. What would you advise?
Yeah, I think not the pregnancy world, but the regular world, you would say, I would aim for about 1,000 milligrams a day of EPA and DHA combined. Roughly 50-50, could be 40-60, 70-30, whatever. But both of them, 1,000 milligrams a day would be fairly typical of the average Japanese intake, at least historical. I mean, the Japanese are now becoming more westernized. The younger people are not following the traditional diets. But historically, the Japanese intake has been around a gram a day. That's a healthy target intake. You can do that with 2 or 3 pills a day, some supplements 1 a day. And you just have to look on the back of the label of the product to see how much EPA and DHA is in there per capsule. And then take enough to get 1,000 a day. Then I think that's a great start.
And final question on this. Supplements are not as well regulated as medicine in almost all countries. Might be a little worse here in the States, I think, than in some others. Is there any concern you might have as you think about these supplements? Is there any way to sort of judge that you're gonna get what you're looking for?
I mean, commonly, the more you spend, the higher the concentration per capsule and the cleaner it is. Not to imply that the ones that are fairly cheap are dirty. They're not. You might get more of a fishy burp from some of the cheaper products. The fishy taste doesn't come from the omega-3. It comes from other oil products, other breakdown products in there. If you get a fishy burp, it doesn't mean that the omega-3s are gone. The omega-3s are still there. I use a product that's got 700 milligrams of EPA and DHA per capsule. That's in a triglyceride form. I think that's important to get a triglyceride form and not an ethyl ester form, which is the drug form, is an ethyl ester form, which is not as well absorbed. Not absorbed, but it's not as well absorbed as the triglyceride, which is more of a natural form.
I think the really big takeaway, Jonathan, from me listening to Bill on this is that any type of supplement is better than no supplement.
Amen.
Because you do see such big disparities in cost. And I would hate to think that someone thought, oh, well, I can only get this like ridiculously expensive one. Yes, it might not be quite as pure, but it's still going to be beneficial in terms of your health. So I think that's really important.
Bill and Sarah, thank you so much for taking us through what's like a sort of quite a tricky and complicated topic. I'm going to try and do a summary, and then I'm counting on you to correct me where I've got it wrong. So I start with the fact that fish oil is not a myth, which is surprising because almost everything I was taught about nutrition when I was growing up seems to have been reversed. But here we're saying there really is something like magical in it, omega-3, but specifically this EPA and DHA. And I think what I've understood, which I hadn't got before, is like omega-3 is sort of like a family, you described it. And within that, there are these different types. ALA is this one from plants, but the one that you're really excited about is EPA and DHA. It does some quite magical things. So although you said it does not lower cholesterol, that is a myth. It can improve your risk for heart disease. And now we have this new science suggesting it can lower your risk for dementia. But also really amazingly, is linked to sort of less anxiety and depression. And you were saying that you think that might be linked to reducing inflammation in the brain, which is interesting because often on this podcast we talk about research which is looking at sort of the microbiome and gut health and the links to inflammation and other things. So it's just interesting to me to hear you say that. You have developed this thing called the Omega-3 index, which actually basically tells me how much of this EPA and DHA is actually in my individual cells. The healthiest is like 8%. You said on average in America, someone has 5%. And for people who are vegans in the military, which I suspect does not have the best diet, you can get as low as 3.5%.
Right.
And you can function in all of this. So it's not like you're going to die by not having this, but you definitely see improvement as you go from average to optimal. You can't visit your doctor and get this measured, which is disappointing, but we will put a link in the show notes for how you can go and get yourself tested. Basically, if you want to get this through food, then you have to go to these oily fish. And you said smash. So I think I wrote down salmon, mackerel, anchovies, sardines, herring. Everything else is much, much lower. So it's not that there's none, but it's not going to really change this percentage in a big way.
Yeah, lower. Much is a little strong. Just lower.
You're allowed to add any foods here that you think are critical. And what I heard is there are plants that are high in ALA. That's definitely better than not having it, but it's really hard to turn that into this EPA and DHA, and hence these algae products, which sound very exciting to me because that's like the original source of this, right?
Yeah,
so you're
right.
just eating the fish in order to get at the plant, basically, or the algae. So that sounds very exciting. We'll see whether we can find any links for that as well, where you can get the direct EPA and DHA. And therefore, Bill, you are supplementing yourself rather than just trying to solve it with food because you want to be at this optimal level. And the key thing I took away was aim for 1,000 milligrams. It's going to be EPA and DHA combined, roughly 50-50, but you weren't too worried about it being 60-40 or 70-30. Critically, though, you can't just buy something that on the front says 1,000 milligrams of fish oil. You need to turn it around and look on the back, and it sounds like you might find that those amounts of EPA and DHA might be quite a bit lower. So you need to do a little bit of calculation to make sure that you're not buying something that seems good on the front but is low on the back. And that is sort of what you do, and that would be your advice for someone who wants to get to the optimal basis.
Right. Well done.
If you've enjoyed this deep dive into omega-3s and brain health with Bill and Sarah, I think you'll really enjoy this conversation with Sarah about omega-3 supplements and whether we really need them. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.